Hey friends, Kevin here, and today we're going to talk about minivans and which ones to buy and which ones to avoid. Because the question that always comes up in comments on my videos on different forums on the internet is which brand should I buy? Which one is the best minivan brand to make into a camper, do a camper conversion to do van life? What brand of minivan should I buy to use to do my build out? The answer is this: there's not a best brand. There are a lot of good brands. There are a lot that will serve you well that have been made over the years. But the thing is, you may not be asking the right question. The right question may be this: which ones are really bad? Which ones do I want to avoid for different reasons? And that's what we want to get into today, because there's three things off the top of my head I can think of for different reasons that you want to avoid like the plague. Three minivan brands that you do not want to spend your money on if you're going to try to go on the road and long trips with these. Now, I'm going to do a whole series on different brands and get into some real detailed specs on the different major, most popular minivan brands. So if you're not a subscriber to this channel, you may want to consider hitting that subscribe button so you don't miss those. But today we're going to talk about the three in particular that you want to run away from. And here they are. The first brand I would not spend your money on, even if I was spending your money. And what you want to avoid is going to be a Volkswagen minivan. And here's why. These things are unbelievably popular in Europe. Right? Over the last 10 or 15 years, they've had a model that's called a T5 that is, people love. It does well. That's great. But I'm going to move this to us here and most of you watching, which is North America and particularly the USA. And as far as that goes, we never got a T5. The newest thing that we technically got that was a real Volkswagen minivan was a T4. And over here it was marketed as a Eurovan. And you're going to run into this a lot. They have different names in Europe on these things than what they have in the United States. And sometimes even Canada ends up with the same vehicle with a different name, and it causes a lot of confusion. Now, those things were sold over here up until about 2003. This was one of the first Volkswagens when they started converting these things over, instead of the old air-cooled engines, to an actual front engine, motor in the front that had liquid to cool the engine. The same thing, this was that same time frame, late 90s, when they got into doing this. They got into doing it with the Beetle and did that conversion. The new Beetle, unlike the old stuff that everybody was accustomed to out of the 60s and 70s. They followed this with a few vehicles, and one of them was doing it with this van. These things were only sold here for a few years, and the reason you want to avoid it is nobody's going to be able to work on these things. They were done so little, it was such a failure as a product that these things sold 3,000 or 4,000 units per year for the 5 or 6 years that they were brought in here. So they're very rare, but you're going to run across them. And what you do not want doing van life, what you do not want doing a conversion here, is anything that is that rare. And to put this into perspective, Dodge Chrysler, which was #1, was selling more minivans in a day than Volkswagen was selling in a year. So there are very few of these things, but they are out there. If you buy them, you're going to have problems. You're going to have problems finding the parts for them. Anything major you need, body panels and things, you're certainly not going to be able to go to a parts yard, junk yard, and stumble into one of these. Parts are going to be higher, and finding somebody that can actually do the repair on these things is going to be really difficult. Because you're talking about now taking an older van. You don't want to go to the dealership because you know what they're going to charge, and taking it to some mechanic that, no matter how good your mechanic is, if he's never worked on these things, you're going to be paying $80 an hour for somebody to experiment and try to figure out how this works and get parts off and put parts on it and troubleshoot. You just don't need those kinds of problems. So you want to stick with something that is out there in big numbers that people have experience with. To make this even way more complicated than it should be, there are these things, and you may have run across this, it's called a Westfalia, which is this Volkswagen platform that has a pop-up roof, and it was made as a camper. This is what you tend to run into these names, even though technically it was sold as a camper van, I think was the name here. But they had a stove, and they had a bed, and they had a little refrigerator, and they had these little systems in there. They were already set up as campers, and they had this pop-top roof that allowed you to sleep kind of up in the top of this thing. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of details on this thing, but here's what I want you to see. I pulled some of these prices up online, and I want you to look at the difference between the standard Volkswagen vans and what they're selling for compared to these Westfalia camper vans with the pop tops. Look at what these things are selling for. You are talking about 10 times as much money. And the only difference, again, is the pop-up top and the little built-in stove and refrigerator and that sort of thing, which again are going to be very old at this point. Now, there is a huge following for these Westfalia vans, and people that have money will pick these things up and spend a fortune on them and run around the country in them, and there's nothing wrong with that. As long as you go into that thing up front, understanding that this vehicle is going to cost you a lot of money to buy, and the second thing, it is probably going to be a money pit. But for the people that have that and they want to do that, more power to them. There's nothing wrong if that's what they enjoy. But if you're just getting into this and you don't have an unlimited budget, these are not the vehicles for you. You want to stay away from them. It's fun when you see them. It's fun to talk to somebody that owns one. It's not something that you probably want to buy. And as if Volkswagen couldn't have made things more complicated, from 2009 to 2014, they made yet another minivan, which was called a Rutan. I think I'm pronouncing that right, and all of their silly little pronunciations. But that Volkswagen Rutan that was sold wasn't a Volkswagen to begin with. It was a Chrysler Town and Country. So Chrysler Town and Countries and Dodge Caravans and Grand Caravans are pretty much the biggest selling minivans year over year over year. This is a version of that. You're going to have different dashboards and different things like that, different door locks and panels. It's those little parts that are going to be really expensive when you have to replace them and really hard to find when you have to replace them. So since you're dealing with a suspension and a drivetrain and all that, that's going to be a Dodge Chrysler product anyway. If I was going to buy one of those vans, I would buy a Dodge Ray Chrysler from those years, 2009 to 2014, and not this Volkswagen. Because I guarantee you're going to pay a premium price for that Volkswagen, and it may have a little bit nicer interior. But again, anything in there that tears up, anything that's custom from their end, again, it's just going to be more expensive to repair. So all of this being aside, Volkswagen is just one of those brands that I am never going to touch for purchasing a minivan. Now, on to the second one, to avoid like the plague. Brand number 2, I even have trouble pronouncing sometimes. I have to say this really slow to attempt to do this right because it's a tongue twister for me. And that is Mitsubishi. Now, Mitsubishi, in the last 5 years, has basically left the United States, even though there are still things being imported in here under that name. This company always had a weird history and with a lot of involvement with Dodge and Chrysler. You had little Dodge pickup trucks that in the late 70s and into the 80s that had Mitsubishi motors. You had stuff being imported in from Mitsubishi that was rebadged. So some of the cars running around that were supposed to be Dodge and Chryslers and Plymouths weren't really Dodge and Chryslers and Plymouths. They were actually little import Mitsubishis. So as far as minivans go, what Mitsubishi actually put into this country was kind of a miniature minivan, and you really don't want any less space in a minivan than what a normal minivan has. And if you've listened to my other videos, you know I talk about a lot of things, and you know, minivans, regardless of brands, the last 25 years all basically have the same dimensions, and that's pretty much true except for something oddball like this. Another reason you want to avoid it, but these things were put in here, some of them were actually marketed as Dodges, and they were Plymouth Colt Vista and all this crap. A Colt, if you remember, or old enough, was a little subcompact car anyway, so this was a little subcompact minivan that was brought in here from Mitsubishi. And in the 90s, they actually got into more of a full-size minivan that they called the Expo. These things were sold from 91 to 97. There's another generation of these things. I know that generation from 91 to 97 was put in the United States. It was sold again, different names in other countries. Until the early 2000s, there was another version of this, but again, you just want to run and avoid these things like the plague. Because again, there aren't very many of them, there's nobody experienced to work on them, and because there's not very many of them, you're going to pay a premium for any parts that you need. And finding experienced mechanics that, you know, let me go into this a little bit further, what you want. A Dodge product or a Toyota product or whatever it is that's based on a standard platform that they make for 8 or 10 years and sell just tons of these vehicles. When you go to an experienced mechanic, they have already probably done this repair. At least that's what you're hoping for. And that's the kind of questions I ask on things. Have you ever done this before on this particular product? Because I don't want to be paying $80 to $100 an hour for these people to be learning. So on your more popular brands, Chevrolets and Dodges and Hondas and Toyotas, you're going to have experienced mechanics that have already worked on these things. When you're into this oddball stuff like these Mitsubishi minivans, you're simply not, and that's going to cost you more hassle and more money. Avoid it like, again, say it with me, avoid it like the plague. And that brings us up to the third that you want to avoid. This third one may surprise you because it's going to be a Toyota. And all the groups and all the forums you go to are going to tell you, hey, the best van that you can buy, the best minivan you can buy, is going to be a Toyota Sienna. That's debatable, may be true. Let's go with that. The problem is they're not all dependable. There was a big group of these section in there that caused people a lot of problems. So if you want a Toyota Sienna, that's great as long as you're not buying one of the ones that's going to cause you a lot of trouble. And here's a little history on this. Toyota's first minivan put into this country, kind of early 90s, was a Previa. And they're getting so old now, you're not going to run into a lot of those. And again, this is one of these kind of miniaturized minivan things, and not really what you want. In 1997, Toyota replaced that with a full-size minivan called the Sienna. They still sell minivans under that name to this day. So roughly 23, 24 model years now, you have of Siennas being sold in this country. The problem is with the first generation of those things, which ran from about 1997 to about 2003 model year. Because the first generation of those had this roughly 3-liter V6 engine, which was roughly the same engine that was in other Toyota products. And they all had a major fatal flaw. And it was what was referred to as a sludge problem. Basically, you have drainage holes between the block and the heads and different parts of the engine that oil circulates around in. And this got blamed on the end consumer anytime there was a problem. Instead of the manufacturer taking the blame for this, it got blamed on you hadn't changed the oil as often as you should. You didn't change the oil every 3,000 miles or whatever. There were a lot of issues over this. There were a lot of lawsuits over this, because what would happen is you would have some sludge build up. It would stop up these holes that were too small, and then the oil could not circulate around your engine the way it was designed to, and you were going to have problems. You were going to have problems with it smoking. You were going to have problems with oil leakage. And the big one, you were going to have problems simply your motor one day would just be trashed. There are people to this day that still swear that this didn't go on, are complete non-believers that Toyota had this problem for 5 or 6 years with their vehicles. I've never understood why people have this attitude that anything an American company does is wrong and anything a foreign company does is right, and they just can do no wrong. Because that isn't true. Everybody makes something bad every once in a while, and for Toyota, it was this engine. And this engine is in every one of these Sienna vans that were popped into this country between 97 and 2002 or 2003. So if you're looking at an older Toyota van, you want to make sure you're in that second generation of these things. When they changed to a different engine, when they did that redesign for Generation 2, and everything from then up till now is going to be a pretty rock-solid Toyota quality vehicle. The 97 to 2002 era stuff, problematic. And you're going to be able to still find some of these. You're going to be able to find some with low mileage. And you're going to find marked up prices because of that Toyota quality. But if you have one of these things, man, it's going to be a ticking time bomb for you. It doesn't matter how religiously you change the oil. It's a problem waiting to happen. So, again, another van that you want to avoid like the plague. Now, I'm sure I'm going to have all kinds of comments put in this video. Well, I had this van and it was awful, and I had this van and it was awful, and I had this van and it was great, and I had this van. I can tell you that any vehicle that you go out and buy, there are going to be good ones, there are going to be bad ones, there are going to be lemons. You can unfortunately get one if you're buying new vehicles. I know someone that had to have a new vehicle bought back in less than a year. The manufacturer bought it back under the lemon law. These things happen. So we're not trying to get into these odd situations. I'm not looking for the exception to the rule. I'm looking for the rule. I'm looking for this is what happens 70% of the time or 90% of the time. I want to put the odds in my favor. And I can tell you, I'm going to put the odds in my favor looking for a minivan to do a camper conversion on for doing van life. I'm going to put those odds in my favor by avoiding these three that I just talked about like the plague. So let me know down below if you got something out of this video, if it helped you out. Let me know if you want me to do more detailed videos on other brands and models of minivans that are out there that have been manufactured in the last 20 years or so. And I may even get into some full-size vans also, if this is what you want me to get into. But remember, I put these videos out to try to help you guys out, to walk you around problems that I and other people that I've met on the road have encountered. So I want you to think of this as your channel. Feel free to ask questions. Let me know what we can do to help you out to go continue on your journey or get started on your journey if you're just looking at this stuff and trying to gain some knowledge. If you're wondering what to watch next, you may want to check out this video I did on the pros and cons of minivans versus large vans, or this video over here, and we'll talk soon.